Dawn crept across the East China Sea on the 11th of May, 1945, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rose that belied the violence to come. Commander Baron Mullaney stood on the bridge of the USS Hugh W. Hadley, a Fletcher-class destroyer that had been holding station at Radar Picket Station 15 for 18 consecutive hours. The night watch had been uneventful, almost eerily quiet, but Mullaney knew better than to interpret silence as safety. He had been in the Pacific theatre long enough to understand that calm seas and clear skies often preceded the most devastating attacks. The destroyer USS Evans maintained station nearby, her grey hull barely visible in the pre-dawn light. Together, the two ships formed the forward defensive screen for the massive American fleet anchored off Okinawa, 50 miles to the south. Their mission was straightforward in concept, but terrifying in execution. Serve as early warning stations for incoming Japanese aircraft, directing combat air patrols to intercept threats before they could reach the vulnerable transport and supply vessels supporting the invasion. In practice, this meant positioning themselves as bait, deliberately exposed and isolated, waiting to draw enemy attacks that would mark them as priority targets. Mullaney had celebrated his 32nd birthday 3 weeks earlier, though celebration was perhaps too strong a word for the quiet dinner he had shared with his executive officer in the wardroom. He looked older than his years. 6 months of continuous combat operations had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His uniform hung looser than it had when Hadley first arrived in the Pacific. Like most commanding officers operating off Okinawa, he survived on coffee, catnaps snatched during brief lulls between general quarters, and the grim determination that came from knowing hundreds of lives depended on his decisions. The campaign for Okinawa had been grinding forward for 6 brutal weeks. American forces had secured the southern portion of the island, but Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination from fortified positions in the rugged terrain. Every yard of advance cost blood and time. The invasion fleet that supported the ground offensive stretched across dozens of miles of ocean, a concentration of naval power unprecedented in human history. Battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, supply vessels, hospital ships, repair tenders, the assemblage represented American industrial might made manifest in steel and gunpowder. But that same concentration of vessels created a target-rich environment that Japanese commanders exploited through tactics that defied every convention of aerial warfare. The kamikaze attacks had transformed naval combat into something entirely new and deeply unsettling. Traditional air attacks involved calculated risk, pilots attempting to deliver weapons and escape to fight another day. The calculus of survival influenced every tactical decision. Kamikaze pilots eliminated survival from their equations entirely, transforming themselves into guided weapons, human beings serving as the final control mechanism ensuring their explosives reached their targets. The threat had emerged gradually, then exploded into devastating effectiveness. Back in October of 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi faced an impossible situation. His first air fleet consisted of just 41 operational aircraft against hundreds of American fighters and bombers supported by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. Conventional attacks had failed completely. Young Japanese pilots with minimal training could not compete against veteran American aviators flying superior aircraft. Even when Japanese planes successfully approached American ships, anti-aircraft fire shredded them before they could deliver their weapons effectively. Onishi, a career naval aviator who had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, understood that desperation demanded radical solutions. On the 19th of October, 1944, he assembled his squadron commanders and proposed the formation of special attack units. Pilots would load their aircraft with bombs and fuel, then deliberately crash into American warships. The human pilot would become the guidance system, compensating for inadequate training and inferior equipment through direct control until the moment of impact. Death would be certain, but so would hitting the target. Captain Motoharu Okamura, who commanded the 341st Air Group, had been advocating for exactly such tactics since June. He volunteered immediately to organize the first missions. Within days, Okamura had recruited volunteers from among the youngest pilots, men barely out of flight school who possessed more ideological fervor than aerial combat experience. They painted their aircraft with patriotic slogans and cherry blossom symbols representing the samurai tradition of beautiful death in service to the emperor. The first coordinated kamikaze attack launched on the 25th of October 1944. 5 aircraft took off from Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a 23-year-old pilot who had married just months before receiving his special attack assignment. The formation targeted American escort carriers operating off Samar Island, part of the massive fleet supporting the invasion of the Philippines. At 10:53 in the morning, Seki's Zero fighter, carrying a 550-pound bomb, dove through anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the flight deck of USS St. Lo. The impact punched through the wooden deck and detonated in the hangar bay among fully fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting explosion triggered a chain reaction that turned the carrier's interior into an inferno. Secondary explosions ripped through bulkheads. Aviation fuel spread flames faster than damage control parties could respond. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo was sinking. 113 men died. A single pilot, a single aircraft, 1 major warship destroyed. The attack validated a terrible equation. Japan could not replace the carriers and battleships lost earlier in the war. American shipyards were producing vessels faster than conventional warfare could destroy them. But Japan still had pilots, aircraft, and fuel enough for one-way missions. If each kamikaze destroyed or seriously damaged one American ship, the mathematics of attrition shifted dramatically. Sacrifice 10 pilots to sink a destroyer. Sacrifice 50 to sink an aircraft carrier. The Imperial Japanese Navy could sustain such losses indefinitely because the pilots had no expectation of return. Within weeks of the first successful attack, Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific organized kamikaze units. Young pilots received abbreviated training that taught basic flying skills, but spent little time on navigation, aerial combat, or emergency procedures. They would not need such knowledge. Their missions required only the ability to reach the target area and recognize American ships. The final approach and impact needed no instruction beyond pointing the aircraft at the largest vessel and maintaining course regardless of defensive fire. By November of 1944, suicide attacks had damaged or sunk more than 30 American vessels in Philippine waters. The Navy's carefully developed air defense system, which had performed brilliantly against conventional bombing during the Battle of the Philippine Sea 6 months earlier, struggled against this unprecedented threat for fundamental reasons that challenged every assumption about aerial warfare. Traditional bombing attacks involved formations approaching at altitude, usually between 15 and 20,000 feet, where heavy bombers could avoid most anti-aircraft fire while maintaining formation integrity. Radar tracked these formations from 75 miles away, providing ample warning. Combat air patrols could intercept them long before they reached the fleet. When bombers approached their targets, they had to fly steady and level for the bombing run, making them vulnerable to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. After releasing their weapons, the bombers would turn away, seeking the protection of altitude and distance. Damaged aircraft would attempt to retreat rather than continue pressing attacks. Kamikazes changed every element of this tactical equation. They approached in small groups or alone, making radar detection difficult because individual aircraft produced minimal returns that could be confused with sea clutter or weather. They flew low, often skimming wave tops at altitudes under 50 feet, staying below radar coverage until the final seconds before impact. When anti-aircraft fire damaged them, they did not retreat. Burning aircraft with wounded or dying pilots still crashed into targets if momentum carried them forward. Even aircraft shot down by combat air patrols sometimes maintained sufficient control for the pilot to guide them into ships during their final moments. Most critically, Kamikaze impacts delivered not just the explosive force of bombs, but the kinetic energy of entire aircraft traveling at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. A Zero fighter weighed around 6,000 pounds empty. Add pilot, bomb, ammunition and fuel, and the impact mass approached 4 tons, traveling at 440 feet per second. The physics were devastating. That much mass moving that fast possessed immense momentum that armor and structure could not easily absorb. The aircraft would penetrate decks, bulkheads, and even armor plate depending on angle and velocity, carrying explosives and hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel deep into the ship before detonating. The combination created catastrophic damage that overwhelmed standard damage control procedures designed for conventional weapons. A torpedo explosion opened a hole in the hull below the waterline, causing flooding that could be controlled through compartmentalization and pumping. An aerial bomb penetrated decks and exploded, causing blast damage and fires in a localized area. Damage control parties could fight fires, shore up weakened structures, and maintain buoyancy using techniques perfected over decades of naval engineering. Kamikaze impacts created simultaneous fires in multiple locations as aviation fuel sprayed through the ship. They severed fire mains and electrical cables, disabling the systems needed to fight the damage they caused. They jammed hatches and watertight doors through blast deformation, preventing compartmentalization. They started gasoline fires that water could not extinguish effectively without foam additives. They killed or wounded the damage control personnel stationed near impact points, depleting the trained specialists needed to coordinate response efforts. The official damage control doctrine, published by the Bureau of Ships and distributed throughout the fleet, emphasized compartmentalization through watertight doors, fighting fires with water from the ship's main fire system, and shoring damaged structures with timber and steel supports. These procedures worked against torpedoes and conventional bombs. They had been developed over decades of naval experience, refined through analysis of damage from previous wars, and validated in countless drills and training exercises. But they failed against kamikazes because the attacks created conditions the doctrine's authors had never imagined. Nobody had anticipated that pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into ships, choosing certain death to guarantee weapon delivery. The USS Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer displacing 2,200 tons and measuring 376 feet long, would become the proving ground that demonstrated how intensive training and tactical preparation could enable survival against overwhelming kamikaze attacks. Her commanding officer, Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, approached damage control with an intensity born from painful personal experience. Beckton had witnessed the sinking of the first USS Laffey at Guadalcanal in November of 1942. He had been serving aboard another vessel during the naval battle of Guadalcanal when Japanese destroyers surprised American screening forces during a night action. The first Laffey had fought bravely, damaging several Japanese vessels before taking multiple hits from destroyer gunfire and torpedoes. She sank quickly in the dark waters off Savo Island. Beckton had watched shipmates die in those waters, men he had trained with and served beside, good sailors who did their duty and died anyway because naval combat allowed no margin for error. His previous command, the destroyer USS Aaron Ward, had been sunk by Japanese dive bombers on April 7, 1943, off Guadalcanal. 27 men died in that attack. 59 were wounded. Beckton himself had been injured but remained at his post, directing damage control efforts until it became clear the ship could not be saved. He had been among the last to abandon ship, stepping off into the oil-slicked water as Aaron Ward's stern rose high before the final plunge. He spent 2 hours in the water before rescue, 2 hours to reflect on what he might have done differently, what preparations might have saved his ship and his men. Those experiences shaped everything about how Beckton commanded Laffey after taking command at her commissioning in February of 1944. He understood viscerally that survival depended on preparation and training beyond what official doctrine required. He had seen ships sink despite following regulations. He had seen crews die despite executing standard procedures. The gap between doctrine and reality, between what the manuals said and what actually worked under combat conditions, could be measured in lives lost and ships sent to the bottom. From Laffey's first day in commission, Beckton drilled his crew relentlessly in damage control procedures. He conducted fire drills weekly, sometimes multiple times per week when schedules permitted. Other commanding officers thought him excessive, even obsessive. The crew grumbled about the constant interruptions to routine. But Beckton remained unmoved by criticism. He had earned the right to obsess about damage control through hard experience. He had abandoned 2 ships to the sea. He would not abandon a third if preparation and training could prevent it. He cross-trained sailors so damage control parties could operate anywhere on the ship, not just at assigned stations. Standard doctrine called for specialized teams responsible for specific spaces, ensuring that trained personnel could respond quickly to damage in their areas. Beckton's approach created redundancy at the cost of administrative simplicity. His sailors could fight fires in the forward engineering spaces or aft crew quarters with equal effectiveness. When casualties depleted specialized teams, survivors could continue damage control operations without waiting for replacement personnel. He positioned firefighting equipment throughout the vessel rather than concentrating it in designated lockers as the damage control manual specified. Standard practice placed foam generators, portable pumps, and other equipment in central locations where they could be drawn as needed. This approach simplified logistics and maintenance. But Beckton had seen what happened when fires blocked access to equipment lockers or when the journey from storage to fire took too long. He scattered firefighting gear throughout Laffey, accepting the maintenance burden in exchange for immediate availability. He ran backup fire hoses from alternative water sources so crews would not depend on the main fire system. Standard engineering provided a primary fire main running the length of the ship with connections at regular intervals. When the main was pressurized, crews could fight fires using strategically positioned hoses, but a single hit could sever the main, depressurizing the entire system. Beckton installed secondary connections running from auxiliary pumps, from portable gasoline-powered pumps staged at multiple locations, from emergency diesel generators that could maintain pressure even when main power failed. His engineering spaces looked cluttered compared to regulation layouts, but every piece of equipment served a purpose validated by combat experience. He welded steel plating around exposed fuel lines and ammunition handling spaces. Regulations specified certain areas as requiring armor protection based on engineering analysis of probable damage patterns. Beckton supplemented official armor with field modifications based on tactical analysis of where kamikazes would most likely strike. He protected fuel lines feeding gun mounts. He reinforced bulkheads around ready ammunition lockers. He added steel plate around hydraulic systems that controlled steering and fire control. These modifications added weight in locations not anticipated by the ship's designers, slightly affecting stability and performance. But they might contain fires long enough for damage control parties to respond. These preparations violated official procedures that called for centralized damage control equipment stored in designated spaces. They contradicted engineering specifications that prohibited unauthorized structural modifications. They departed from fleet standard practices that emphasized uniformity and administrative simplicity. But they reflected Beckton's combat experience and tactical analysis of where kamikazes would most likely strike and what systems would fail first. On the 16th of April, 1945, Beckton's preparations faced their ultimate test. Laffey was stationed at Radar Picket Station 1, 30 miles northwest of Okinawa, the most exposed and dangerous position in the defensive perimeter. The designation Radar Picket Station understated the reality. These stations served as sacrificial positions where destroyers deliberately exposed themselves to draw attacks away from the main fleet. Every commanding officer assigned to picket duty understood the mathematics. Their ships would be attacked. Survival depended on how well they prepared for the inevitable. At 8:30 in the morning, Laffey's air search radar detected multiple bogies approaching from the north. The radar operator, a 20-year-old from Ohio who had been tracking aircraft for 11 months, immediately recognized the pattern. Multiple contacts, low altitude, approaching in loose formation rather than organized groups. Kamikazes. Becton ordered general quarters. Throughout the destroyer, alarm bells rang and men ran to battle stations. In the engineering spaces below the waterline, sailors secured watertight doors and prepared to operate in sealed compartments where they could neither see nor hear the battle above. On the weather decks, gun crews loaded ammunition and trained their weapons toward the approaching threats. In the Combat Information Center, radar operators and fire control technicians coordinated defensive fire while radioing warnings to other vessels and requesting combat air patrol support. For the next 80 minutes, 22 separate kamikaze attacks struck Laffey in what became one of the war's most intense aerial assaults against a single ship. The attacks came in waves, sometimes individually, sometimes in coordinated groups that divided defensive fire. Japanese pilots displayed varying levels of skill. Some maneuvered violently, attempting to evade anti-aircraft fire while closing for their final runs. Others approached steadily, maintaining course despite damage, seemingly indifferent to the explosive shells bursting around their aircraft. 6 aircraft crashed into the destroyer. 4 additional bombs hit directly when kamikazes broke apart under defensive fire, their bombs continuing toward the ship even after the aircraft disintegrated. The crew fought fires in 5 locations simultaneously. The forward fire main severed during the 3rd kamikaze impact, depressurizing the primary firefighting system. The after engine room flooded when a bomb penetrated the deck and exploded below the waterline, killing everyone stationed there instantly. Steering control failed when hydraulic lines were cut by fragments. Yet Laffey survived. Damage control parties fought fires that should have destroyed the ship using techniques and equipment positioning that Becton had implemented through intensive training. When the main fire system failed at 900 hours, crews used backup hoses rigged from alternative pump sources. Portable gasoline-powered pumps, pre-positioned based on Becton's tactical analysis, provided water pressure where the main system had failed. When gasoline fires erupted near the forward gun mounts from aviation fuel spread by kamikaze impacts, firefighting foam was available immediately because Becton had pre-positioned foam generators rather than storing them in equipment lockers that were now inaccessible due to fire and structural damage. When flames threatened the forward magazine where 5-inch shells and powder charges were stored, crews flooded it using alternate pumping arrangements Becton had installed. Standard doctrine called for magazine flooding through dedicated systems activated from Damage Control Central. But Damage Control Central had been wrecked by a bomb hit that killed 6 men. The emergency flooding system Becton had rigged allowed local control, letting sailors at the scene make the critical decision and execute it immediately without waiting for permission from command authority that no longer existed. The steel plating and structural reinforcement Becton's crew had installed around critical fuel lines and ammunition handling spaces contained several fires long enough for repair parties to extinguish them before they could spread. A gasoline fire that erupted in the aft crew quarters was contained by supplementary bulkhead armor that prevented flames from reaching the after steering compartment. When that armor began radiating enough heat to threaten equipment on the other side, repair parties played water streams on the protected side, cooling it sufficiently to prevent ignition while fighting the fire from the accessible direction. By 1000 hours, Laffey remained afloat and fighting, though barely recognizable as the sleek destroyer that had entered combat 90 minutes earlier. Her superstructure was a twisted ruin. Her mast leaned at a crazy angle, held upright more by cables than structural integrity. Smoke poured from multiple locations. Bodies lay on deck where there had been no time to move them below. The wounded outnumbered the able-bodied in some spaces. But the ship had not sunk. She had not exploded. She maintained enough buoyancy and stability to be taken under tow. Lafay lost 32 men killed and 71 wounded from a crew of 336, nearly one-third casualties, against 6 direct kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes, against fires in 5 locations, against loss of steering and propulsion, against flooding that should have dragged her under. She survived. Preparation and training kept her operational when, by all reasonable expectation, she should have joined the hundreds of vessels resting on the Pacific floor. Commander Beckton's after-action report, filed 10 days later when he finally had time to document the engagement, detailed the crew's actions during the attack with clinical precision. He specifically documented how intensive training and equipment pre-positioning contributed to survival. He noted which modifications proved most valuable. He identified which standard procedures had failed under combat conditions. He recommended changes to fleet-wide damage control doctrine based on Lafay's experience. He wrote in the dispassionate language of official reports, but the subtext was clear. His crew survived because they had prepared for exactly the situation they encountered. Within days, Beckton's report reached Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, commander of escort carrier groups supporting Okinawa operations. Durgin, a career aviator who had been flying Navy aircraft since before the war, recognized that Beckton's approach represented practical solutions to problems the entire fleet faced. The Admiral had been reading after-action reports from dozens of ships for weeks. A pattern emerged from the wreckage and survival statistics. Ships whose commanders prepared their crews intensively survived at higher rates than ships relying on standard procedures. Durgin ordered Beckton's report distributed throughout the fleet with instructions that commanding officers review it with their damage control parties. He recommended that Bureau of Ships examine Beckton's field modifications for potential fleet-wide implementation. He initiated a study examining the correlation between training intensity and survival rates, suspecting what the data would confirm. Preparation mattered more than ship size, armor thickness, or defensive armament. The pattern that emerged from studying multiple kamikaze attacks revealed widespread adaptation across the Pacific Fleet, an organizational learning process happening simultaneously on dozens of vessels as crews confronted unprecedented threats and developed solutions through trial, error, and grim necessity. Aboard USS Franklin, a fleet carrier that survived devastating bombing on March 19, 1945, damage control teams demonstrated that standard firefighting procedures were completely insufficient for aviation fuel fires aboard ships carrying millions of gallons of high-octane gasoline. Franklin had been operating 50 miles off the Japanese home islands when 2 bombs penetrated her wooden flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay. The detonations occurred among 31 fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. The resulting fires transformed Franklin's interior into an inferno that killed 724 men in the first minutes. For 10 hours, damage control parties fought fires that reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum and soften steel. Standard damage control doctrine called for fighting fires with water from the ship's main fire system. Franklin's main fire system was destroyed in the first minutes of combat. The ship's war damage report, completed by the Bureau of Ships in September 1946 after extensive interviews with survivors and examination of physical damage, documented that crew members organized makeshift fire parties using whatever equipment remained operational after the initial attack. The ship's diesel-powered emergency fire pump, designed as backup for the main system, was started manually after all electrical power failed. Sailors reached it through smoke so thick they crawled on hands and knees, navigating by memory through spaces they could not see. The pump provided barely adequate water pressure, but enough to prevent total loss while repair parties fought their way through the ship restoring damaged systems. Cruiser USS Santa Fe came alongside in a controlled crash maneuver that required exceptional seamanship. Her commanding officer deliberately scraped his ship against the burning carrier's hull, allowing transfer of firefighting equipment and removal of casualties. Santa Fe's crew passed over portable pumps, hoses, foam generators, medical supplies, and fresh damage control personnel to replace Franklin's casualties. They evacuated wounded men across the rubbing hulls, while both ships maneuvered to maintain gentle contact without causing further damage. The technique was improvised, unrehearsed, and completely successful. The techniques Franklin's crew developed during those 10 hours of fighting fires became case studies in damage control schools after the war. The Bureau of Ships War Damage Report recommended numerous improvements based on Franklin's experience, positioning additional fire hoses throughout ships so that any location could be reached from multiple directions, providing portable pumps for backup capability independent of main power systems, improving foam suppression systems specifically designed for aviation fuel fires rather than general-purpose firefighting, and installing quick-access hatches in armoured doors to permit escape when standard exits jammed due to blast deformation or heat warping. These recommendations came directly from observing what Franklin's crew improvised during the crisis. They had discovered through brutal necessity that water alone could not extinguish gasoline fires effectively without foam additives to smother flames and prevent reignition. They learned that sealed compartments could trap personnel when doors jammed, turning fire-resistant spaces into ovens. They found that centralized fire systems created single points of failure that left entire sections of the ship without firefighting capability when key junctions were damaged. Every lesson was purchased, with lives lost, spaces burned, and equipment destroyed. On destroyers operating radar picket duty off Okinawa, damage control innovations emerged from different pressures. Destroyers lacked the armor protection of larger vessels. They could not absorb damage the way carriers and battleships could. A single kamikaze impact that a carrier might survive with moderate casualties could completely wreck a destroyer. Yet destroyers served as the fleet's forward defense, positioned deliberately in harm's way to provide early warning and intercept threats before they reached more valuable vessels. Destroyer crews developed modifications focused on redundancy and rapid response. They installed secondary fire mains, routing through different paths than primary systems, ensuring that a single hit could not disable all firefighting capability. They positioned foam proportioning stations near areas where aviation fuel from kamikazes would most likely spread. They welded steel plates around exposed fuel and hydraulic lines in spaces where fragments from near misses commonly caused fires that could not be fought quickly enough using standard procedures. They positioned portable gasoline-powered pumps as backup systems that could operate when all electrical power failed. These pumps weighed 60 pounds each, required manual starting like lawnmower engines, and produced fraction of the output of main fire pumps. But they worked when nothing else did, and that made them invaluable. Sailors secured them in locations throughout their ships, ensuring that damage control parties could reach at least one pump regardless of which section suffered damage. At Ulithi Atoll, where the fleet retired between operations for repairs and resupply, Navy construction battalions and civilian ship fitters developed rapid repair techniques that deliberately departed from official procedure but restored ships to service within days instead of months. Standard practice, established by the Bureau of Ships and enforced through detailed regulations, required that damaged sections be cut away and replaced with new steel fabricated to exact specifications, certified by engineering authorities, and installed under supervision of qualified naval architects. The process ensured quality and structural integrity. It also took weeks or months to complete. Seabees at Ulithi, practical men recruited from civilian construction trades who understood that perfect engineering was sometimes the enemy of good enough, cut patches from sections of damaged ships that were being scrapped, shaped them with cutting torches and sledgehammers, and welded them in place using whatever materials were available. The repairs were expedient rather than elegant. Welds were neither as smooth nor as uniform as Bureau of Ships specifications required. Steel thickness did not always match precisely, but the patches held under combat conditions and got ships back into action when the fleet needed every vessel operational. These field repairs violated official procedures. They lacked proper authorization from shore-based engineering authorities. They used non-standard materials and techniques that would never pass formal inspection. But they worked, and in the context of sustained combat operations, where damaged ships outnumbered repair facilities, practical effectiveness trumped administrative compliance. Ships repaired at Ulithi returned to combat and survived subsequent engagements, validating the CB's pragmatic approach. The specific technical innovations that emerged across the fleet during the Kamikaze campaign shared common characteristics that revealed how effective organizations adapt under pressure. They were developed by sailors with direct combat experience, who understood intimately where damage was likely to occur and what systems would fail first. They were not developed by engineers in shore facilities or by committees studying theoretical problems. They emerged from men who had fought fires, patched holes, and carried wounded shipmates while their vessels burned. They violated official procedures or lacked proper authorization from distant shore-based authorities. They represented local solutions to immediate problems, implemented by commanding officers willing to accept responsibility for departing from regulations. In peacetime, such unauthorized modifications would trigger investigations and possibly disciplinary action. In wartime, results mattered more than compliance. They worked under actual combat conditions in ways that theoretical approaches did not. The ultimate validation came not from engineering analysis or administrative approval, but from survival statistics and after-action reports documenting what happened when ships were actually hit. Ships with field modifications survived at higher rates. That empirical evidence proved more compelling than any theoretical argument. Ships arriving at Okinawa in late May and June 1945 incorporated modifications that earlier vessels had improvised under fire. Commanding officers read after-action reports from ships like Laffey, Franklin, and others that had survived despite tremendous damage. They identified which modifications proved most valuable. They implemented similar changes aboard their own vessels before encountering kamikazes themselves. Damage control parties trained in techniques developed by crews with combat experience. Repair facilities stockpiled materials for rapid implementation of proven modifications. The learning curve was steep and expensive, but the fleet climbed it through collective determination. The Navy's adaptation to the kamikaze threat represented organizational learning under extreme pressure, institutional change happening far faster than peacetime bureaucracies typically permit. The Bureau of Ships investigation into kamikaze damage, completed in late 1945 after the war ended and researchers could comprehensively examine evidence from hundreds of attacked vessels, documented that ships with the best survival rates were those whose crews had implemented field modifications before attacks occurred. The report examined damage sustained by dozens of vessels, comparing survival rates, casualties, repair times, and effectiveness of various damage control techniques. The statistical evidence was compelling and unambiguous. During the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945, kamikazes conducted more than 1,900 individual attacks against American vessels. They sank 36 ships and damaged 368 others, killing 4,900 American sailors and wounding 4,800 more. The human cost was staggering. Yet the majority of ships hit by kamikazes survived, and the fleet maintained operational effectiveness throughout the campaign. The difference between survival and sinking often came down to minutes or even seconds. Could damage control parties reach fires before they spread to magazines containing hundreds of tons of explosives? Could backup systems maintain electrical power and water pressure when primary systems failed? Could crews improvise repairs using available materials when standard equipment was destroyed or inaccessible? Ships whose crews had prepared for these contingencies before attacks occurred survived at significantly higher rates than those relying entirely on standard procedures and official doctrine. The Bureau of Ships study attempted to quantify this difference. Researchers examined 212 ships hit by kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign. 36 sank. 176 survived, despite damage ranging from minor to catastrophic. Surviving ships averaged twice as many damage control personnel assigned compared to vessels that sank. They conducted damage control drills 3 times more frequently. They had implemented field modifications at twice the rate. The correlations were statistically significant, even accounting for differences in ship type, armor protection, and attack severity. Commander Baron Mullaney, standing on Hadley's bridge as dawn broke on May 11th, knew none of these statistics. The studies would not be completed for months, but he understood intuitively what the data would later confirm. His ship's survival would depend on preparation, training, and his crew's ability to respond effectively when standard procedures proved inadequate. He had trained them relentlessly since Hadley's commissioning in November 1944. Now they would discover whether that training was sufficient. At 800 hours, Hadley's air search radar detected the first contacts. Multiple bogies approaching from the north, estimated range 40 miles. Combat air patrol fighters were vectored to intercept, but there were too many attackers and too few defenders. Some Japanese aircraft would penetrate the fighter screen, some would reach the destroyers. Mullaney ordered general quarters and watched his crew respond with the practiced efficiency that came from endless drills. For 95 minutes that morning, Hadley and the destroyer USS Evans faced waves of Japanese aircraft in what became one of the war's most intense kamikaze attacks against surface vessels. The Combat Information Center tracked dozens of separate contacts. Fighter direction officers radioed vectors to combat air patrol fighters, guiding them toward threats. Gun crews fired continuously, their 5-inch guns heating to temperatures that required cooling between salvos to prevent ammunition cook-offs in the breaches. Hadley's gunners shot down 23 enemy aircraft, setting a record for aerial victories in a single engagement that remains unmatched by any destroyer. The crew's training and fire discipline kept weapons operational through sustained attack when barrels were so hot they glowed dull red and ammunition handlers were passing shells as fast as human muscles could move. Combat air patrols vectored by Hadley's fighter direction team shot down additional aircraft before they could reach the destroyers, but the sheer number of attackers overwhelmed defensive fire. 4 aircraft and 1 bomb struck Hadley despite her effective gunnery. The impacts killed 30 crew members instantly and wounded 67 others. Fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Engineering spaces flooded when bomb damage opened the hull to the sea. The fantail settled low in the water as flooding progressed faster than pumps could compensate. Commander Mullaney ordered all but 50 crew members into life rafts, retaining only essential damage control personnel to fight fires and prevent the ship from breaking apart completely. The decision to abandon most of the crew was agonizing but necessary. The ship could not support everyone while fighting for survival. Men in the water had better chances than men trapped aboard a sinking vessel. The remaining damage control parties kept Hadley afloat through determination, technical skill, and willingness to work in conditions that should have killed them. They isolated flooding by securing watertight doors and hatches, some of which were warped from heat and impact to the point where several men had to force them closed. They fought fires in multiple locations using portable pumps when the main fire system failed completely. They maintained enough buoyancy that tugboats could eventually tow the crippled destroyer to Karama Retto anchorage. Hadley survived but was too damaged for combat repair. She was towed back to the United States, decommissioned in December 1945, and sold for scrap in 1947. Her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions on May 11th. Commander Mullaney received the Navy Cross. The ship's survival demonstrated that even against overwhelming attacks, well-trained damage control parties using proper techniques and equipment could prevent total loss, though they could not always preserve the vessel for return to service. The innovations developed during the Kamikaze campaign became permanent features of naval damage control doctrine, incorporated into training manuals, design specifications, and fleet-wide procedures that continue influencing naval operations decades later. Post-war training incorporated lessons from ships like Laffey, Franklin, and Hadley. The principle that equipment should be positioned based on tactical analysis of likely damage patterns rather than administrative convenience became standard practice, overturning decades of doctrine emphasizing centralized storage and uniform procedures. Pre-positioning firefighting gear near probable impact points, running redundant fire mains from alternative sources, using foam specifically designed for gasoline and aviation fuel fires rather than water alone. Installing supplementary armor around critical spaces based on combat analysis rather than original design specifications. All these practices originated as field modifications that crews implemented under combat pressure and proved effective through survival statistics. Modern naval vessels reflect design features that trace directly to 1945 improvisations that desperate sailors invented while their ships burned. Collective protection systems providing redundant firefighting capability evolved from backup hoses crews rigged at Okinawa when main systems failed. Pre-action foam systems in aviation fuel storage areas and refueling spaces developed from techniques improvised aboard carriers fighting gasoline fires. Damage control training emphasizing rapid response and tactical adaptation rather than rigid adherence to written procedures continues the philosophy that survival depends on thinking sailors applying sound principles in novel situations, not merely following standardized responses to anticipated scenarios. The Navy's Bureau of Ships Statistical Analysis, completed in 1998 as part of a comprehensive review of wartime damage data, confirmed observations made in 1945. Ships with aggressive, well-trained damage control parties survived kamikaze hits at significantly higher rates than ships relying on minimal crews and standard procedures alone. The study examined all 212 ships hit by kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign, analyzing survival rates, casualty figures, repair times, and effectiveness of various response techniques, while controlling for variables like ship type, attack severity, and defensive capabilities. The Navy's transformation during the kamikaze crisis demonstrated institutional capacity for rapid learning under pressure, organizational adaptability that enabled an enormous bureaucracy to change fundamental practices while simultaneously conducting the largest naval campaign in history. The fleet adapted to unprecedented threats by empowering commanding officers and crew members to develop practical solutions, trusting their judgment over distant headquarters mandates. This required acknowledging that official procedures were sometimes inadequate, that combat experience generated better approaches than peacetime analysis could anticipate, and that survival sometimes demanded violating regulations. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, who commanded Laffey through her April 16th ordeal, retired as Rear Admiral in 1966 after a distinguished career spanning more than 30 years. Throughout his service, he emphasized that Laffey's survival resulted from crew training and preparation that exceeded official requirements. Beckton's insistence on intensive damage control drills, equipment pre-positioning based on tactical analysis rather than administrative convenience, and cross-training that created redundancy in critical skills became models for destroyer operations throughout the Navy. The modern Navy's damage control training program, taught at facilities across the country to thousands of sailors annually, uses Laffey's experience as a primary case study. Instructors describe the 80-minute battle in detail, explaining how specific preparations contributed to survival. They emphasize that training and preparation determine outcomes more reliably than technology or firepower. They teach that effective damage control requires thinking independently, adapting to circumstances, and sometimes disregarding procedures when conditions demand innovation. The sailors who survived Okinawa became carriers of institutional knowledge that shaped the post-war Navy for decades. Many served careers spanning 30 or 40 years, training subsequent generations of damage control specialists, engineering officers, and commanding officers. They ensured that lessons purchased with blood and trauma would not be forgotten when peace returned and organizational memory faded. They told stories of ships that sank and ships that survived, making clear that the difference was preparation, not luck. Others returned to civilian life, carrying understanding that effective organizations empower people closest to problems to develop solutions. They brought that philosophy to businesses, schools, governments, and communities, influencing American organizational culture far beyond military contexts. The generation that fought the Second World War transformed not just the military but civilian institutions, applying lessons learned under extreme pressure to peacetime challenges. The legacy of the Kamikaze campaign extends beyond specific techniques or equipment modifications. It established principles about how effective organizations function under pressure, how institutional learning happens in crisis, and how individual initiative combines with collective purpose to overcome challenges that seem impossible. These principles remain relevant because the fundamental dynamics of organizational performance transcend particular technologies or historical contexts. Effective organizations learn rapidly from experience, collecting information from those closest to problems, analyzing it systematically, and implementing solutions without bureaucratic delay. The Navy's response to kamikazes demonstrated this capacity. After-action reports from ships like Laffey reached fleet commanders within days. Recommended modifications were distributed fleet-wide within weeks. Ships incorporated proven innovations before facing combat themselves. The learning cycle operated at speeds peacetime bureaucracies rarely achieve. Effective organizations empower personnel to make decisions under pressure, trusting their judgment rather than requiring approval for every action. Commanding officers like Frederick Beckton implemented modifications without waiting for authorization because they understood their ships and missions better than distant headquarters could. Damage control parties improvised techniques because survival demanded immediate action, not deliberation. The organization trusted them to make sound decisions based on training and circumstances. Effective organizations incorporate lessons into doctrine rapidly, changing official procedures to reflect proven practices rather than defending established approaches. The Bureau of Ships modified fleet-wide damage control doctrine based on combat experience, acknowledging that pre-war procedures were inadequate and that sailors had developed better methods. This willingness to admit mistakes and change course represented organizational humility that large bureaucracies often lack. The statistical measure of this achievement appears in survival rates that defy the terrible mathematics of kamikaze warfare. Despite 1,900 attacks over 10 months, despite 36 ships sunk and more than 400 damaged, the Pacific Fleet maintained operational effectiveness throughout the Okinawa campaign. Japanese commanders never achieved the decisive blow they sought. The fleet absorbed punishment that would have crippled any previous naval force in history and continued fighting with barely diminished capability. This resilience was built by thousands of individual acts of initiative, preparation, and courage by sailors whose names appear in no history books but whose contributions determined outcomes. Damage control specialists who fought fires until overcome by heat and smoke, then returned when breathing became possible. Engineering officers who kept machinery operating despite flooding and battle damage. Commanding officers who prepared their crews beyond minimum standards because they understood that survival demanded excellence. These unnamed individuals, multiplied across dozens of ships and thousands of engagements, built the foundation for victory. In the final analysis, human ingenuity applied to unprecedented problems determined outcomes more than technology, resources, or material superiority. American ships were larger and better armed than Japanese vessels. American industry produced material in quantities Japan could never match. But those advantages would have meant nothing if crews could not respond effectively when kamikazes crashed through defenses and set their ships ablaze. Victory required not just superior equipment, but superior preparation, not just adequate procedures, but adaptive thinking, not just following orders, but exercising independent judgment when circumstances demanded innovation. These qualities represented fundamental aspects of American military culture that trace back through the nation's history. Trust in individual initiative reflected democratic values emphasizing personal responsibility and independent thought. Expectation that sailors should think independently rather than merely obey reflected educational systems that taught problem-solving rather than rote memorization. Recognition that those facing combat understood combat requirements better than distant commanders reflected practical attitudes valuing experience over theoretical knowledge. The sailors who survived Okinawa demonstrated enduring truths about human performance under pressure. Preparation matters profoundly, determining whether training becomes instinctive response during crisis, or whether people freeze when circumstances overwhelm them. Training saves lives more reliably than armor or weaponry, because trained people adapt to unexpected situations, while untrained people panic. Questioning inadequate procedures represents professional responsibility rather than insubordination, because effective organizations value accuracy over hierarchy. Most importantly, organizations succeed when they empower rather than constrain their people, trusting judgment over mandating compliance. The Navy's response to kamikazes succeeded because commanding officers had authority to prepare their ships as circumstances required, because damage control specialists could innovate techniques, because the institution valued results over procedural compliance. That organizational culture, more than any specific modification or technique, explains why the fleet survived the most intense aerial assault in naval history. The legacy endures in modern naval damage control procedures incorporating lessons from 1945. It persists in training programs, emphasizing adaptation and initiative rather than rigid procedures. It continues in cultural expectations that sailors exercise independent judgment when circumstances require, trusting their training and experience rather than waiting for instructions. These practices represent living connections to men who fought and died off Okinawa, ensuring their sacrifices produced lasting improvements rather than temporary expedients forgotten when crisis passed. Most fundamentally, the legacy reminds us that wars are won not by technology or grand strategy alone, but by ordinary people refusing to accept defeat, finding ways to survive impossible situations, and persisting despite fear and exhaustion. The fleet survived the kamikazes because American sailors combined technical competence with tactical flexibility, because commanding officers like Frederick Beckton prepared their crews beyond minimum standards, and because damage control specialists throughout the fleet developed practical solutions to novel problems that official doctrine had never anticipated. The mechanics, ship fitters, and damage control specialists who improvised repairs at forward bases were not seeking recognition or advancement. They wanted to survive and help their shipmates survive. They found ways to fight fires, contain damage, and keep critical systems operational through whatever means proved necessary. They shared what they learned so others could benefit. They trained their crews beyond official requirements because they understood that survival demanded excellence. They modified their ships to meet tactical realities rather than administrative preferences. They did what was necessary rather than merely what was authorized. That spirit of practical adaptation under pressure represents their most important legacy, more valuable than specific equipment modifications or procedural improvements. The principle that effective forces empower people to think, adapt, and solve problems independently when circumstances demand innovation remains as relevant today as in 1945. Technologies change, threats evolve, circumstances vary, but the fundamental dynamics of human performance under pressure remain constant. Organizations that trust their people succeed. Organizations that constrain them fail. The sailors who survived the kamikazes proved this truth through blood and determination, creating lessons that transcend their particular conflict and speak to universal aspects of human excellence under impossible circumstances.